Hi, my name is Jay. I'm from Charlottesville. And the only question I had, I can agree with the recent wars of Afghanistan, but I question, do you feel the same way about the Revolutionary War, the World War II, Simon Bolivar's war in South America? Are you still, they could have not, should have not, blah, blah, blah?
Well, I don't put it exactly blah, 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 but I do discuss I do discuss most of those wars in the book, and I do find them to be fundamentally based on lies. I don't think that Canada did less of a job overcoming British tyranny than we did. I don't think the rest of the hemisphere and the world did a worse job of getting rid of slavery than we did. You know, if we had built the pressure on the Senate, because the House was there, to get rid of slavery, maybe we could have kept the Union too. But if the South had been allowed to leave and had been isolated, the North would have thrown out the fugitive slave law immediately. The South would not have lasted long with slavery. Slavery would have ended just as it ended in all the other countries in the hemisphere. You don't always have to have a war. And when you can tack a good cause onto a war, that doesn't necessarily justify the war. And of course, slavery was a belated motivation for the Civil War that was long underway when the president decided that he needed something stronger than preserve the Union if people were going to keep slaughtering each other. Patriotism had not been built into the madness that it is today. People wouldn't die for that crap. And so he said, this is about freeing the slaves, but only in those places where I have no power to free the slaves unless we win the war, not in the border states, because, you know, this is all about a motivation for war. And of course, you know, in conversations about disreputable wars, it is almost inevitable that you end up spending 90% of your time talking about World War II. I mean, World War II is like a holy relic. You just cannot, it's taboo to say anything negative about Roosevelt or Churchill. It's just not done. And yet, to begin with, if you're going to claim that the war machine should be kept around, and we might have a just and good war next week because you support World War II, it's a very strange claim to make, to go back 70 years to a completely different planet that was not absolutely dominated by the US military to find a war that you can justify. Right? It's a very long stretch. I think we could give you World War II and still have an overwhelming case that we have to get rid of war. But World War II was based on as many lies as any other war, perhaps more. It was the most destructive act in human history. We claim after the fact that it was to save 6 million people from an evil dictator. And of course he was an evil dictator. But we killed 70 million people and we did not save the 6 million people. In fact, we refused to help them for years. And we made sure that the war had nothing to do with helping the Jews or the refugees or any victims in Nazi Germany. Franklin Roosevelt killed in committee year after year a bill to let 20,000 Jewish children, refugees, into this country, and the homes were there waiting for them. This was a war that at the time that the war was fought had nothing to do with the justifications that we tack onto it, looking back at it. Which is not to say that Germany and Japan didn't have aggressive, imperialistic dictators. It is no defense of the enemies in a war to point out the lies on one side of the war. Franklin Roosevelt followed Woodrow Wilson's model. Right? He lied repeatedly about German submarine attacks on US ships, pretended they were unprovoked, when of course the ships were working with British planes to bomb the submarines. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill worked very hard to get Japan to attack the United States. Worked through providing military aid and even pilots to China. Worked through provocative measures of building up bases and airstrips around the Pacific. and through harsh sanctions that cut off 3/4 of Japan's foreign trade. Japan was being destroyed. One of the judges at the war tribunals after the war concluded that the United States had provoked Japan. And I think there's a strong legal case for that, which, again, is not to defend bombing Pearl Harbor. There is no defense for aggressively attacking someone else, whether they wanted it and provoked it or not. But it is to say that Japan was not the only country that wanted war. We wanted the war too. Roosevelt wanted the war too. The draft was in place. We were providing the weapons. We just wanted to get in, and we couldn't get in Europe unless we got in with Japan attacking. And so there was a concerted effort. There were meetings. In fact, the Downing Street minutes, that were such a nice piece of evidence of a meeting that Blair had at 10 Downing Street on U.S. plans to get into war with Iraq. You can find similar minutes of a meeting at Downing Street with Winston Churchill talking about the need to provoke an incident and get the U.S. into the war, and U.S. plans in that regard. And the United States knew that the attack was coming and knew it was coming on Pearl Harbor and so forth. We spent decades leading up to World War II preparing for World War II. I mean, it was insanity. We had been through hell in World War I. Instead of punishing the important people responsible for World War I, we punished the entire nation of Germany. We guaranteed World War II, and then Wall Street invested in the Nazis more than in any other nation in Europe. And our research institutes invested in Nazi eugenics. We should have been investing in nonviolence training among Germans, so that when those German women went and freed their Jewish husbands and that protest was building and the Nazis were scared out of their boots, it would have grown and grown and grown. And instead, we had invested in all the wrong things and continued to through the war, and didn't bomb the Ford factories. In fact, the Germans learned to hide in the Ford factories. There's nothing that can be said in defense of the conduct of Germany or Japan. It's just that there's very little that can be said in defense of our conduct either, or the British conduct, who bombed civilian targets in Germany in revenge for Germany having done it in England before Germany did it in England. I mean, these guys are the masters of war lies. And World War II is the lie on which dozens of wars have been based ever since. I mean, the damage that this thing has done, that we may not survive, has been for 60 years. Did you have a question?
Just a comment. Americans tend to think that good versus evil.
Mm-hmm.
Like during Vietnam, Americans would look at the South Vietnamese government and see it as evil, and assume the North Vietnamese were good because the South Vietnamese was evil. Other people would look at North Vietnam and see them as evil and assume the South Vietnamese were good. Both observations are true.
Well, there's good and evil everywhere, but we also would look at a people who were poorer and different from us and assume that they couldn't possibly have a will of their own and want national independence and sovereignty. There must be a communist plot behind it. If they weren't bowing down before us, they must be bowing down before the communists. And so we see the world, or that is, our war planners see the world through some very distorting lenses. Yes, here and then back here and then.
3 brief comments. It makes living in Charlottesville a dignified experience, knowing that one of my personal heroes is living here. You are so lucid, you know so much, and you are ethical, and you're able to generate remarkable trains of reasoning. Second point, I look forward to the privilege of buying your book this evening and reading it in the days to come. Third point, I wonder if by emphasizing lies, you are giving somehow too much credibility to the general reader who might be able to turn the war machine around. I'm wondering if, in fact, the war machine is able to thrive as it does because of so many irrational causes you mentioned, war propaganda. You also mentioned power and profit. I wonder if we are not being collectively led around by our noses by people who have a great deal of power and who are receiving a great deal of profit, drawing attention to the lies that are perpetuated is one intervention, and I'm rambling, but the final point would be, how about a different book? How about a book that draws attention to the individuals who are personally profiting? We're seeing record profits on Wall Street, and maybe it would rally some kind of schadenfreude internally in the U.S. against the people who are doing so well. Wouldn't we like to bring down the people who are running the war machine?
Yes, we would. Thank you for your comments. And when I say lies, I don't mean, and I don't discuss in the book, just specific, detailed, rational claims of this missile was launched from here on this day, but lies of the nature of propaganda campaigns that are based around racism and religious bigotry and all sorts of things that we often think of as irrational urges. I mean, the entire propaganda operation needs to be better understood and in order to be better resisted. But yes, if we're going to stop this, we have to take over our government. We have to not just have the understanding that I'm trying to give people in this book, which some of you already have, but we have to find the power to have ourselves represented in our representative government, and that's going to take massive public efforts and reforms if we're going to get there. And one area where we lack any sort of power is in law enforcement. Here we have a situation where Bush and Cheney, to take some prominent examples, are on television bragging about felonies. And Bradley Manning and Julian Assange are in 23-hour lockdown, amounting to torture, being driven insane, perhaps before long in Bradley Manning's case, without any charges being levied against them. So these are the two sides of the lawlessness that we've moved into. We have organizations like Acorn, that I used to work for, destroyed without a criminal allegation, destroyed by Congress and the media and the powers in Washington and the White House. And you have those who openly confess to the most serious crimes, the crime of aggression, torture, lawless imprisonment, kidnapping. To the great credit of Italy, they increased the sentences today for our CIA agents whom they've convicted of kidnapping in absentia. They can't go to Europe, but they're not in trouble as long as they stay here. But we are in a situation now where there is no rule of law on both sides. You can be imprisoned for life in Guantanamo or elsewhere without any charges, any trial, any process. And you can be free to roam the earth or to start up a think tank in Texas, confessing to the worst crimes imaginable. And you can accuse people like Julian Assange of the very same crime that you praised other reporters in this country for, because one is against your war agenda and the other isn't. I think we had a couple of hands before that I didn't get to. So there, and then back in the back.
Can you really call it lies if they've explained exactly what they're going to do? They were actually telling the truth in the Rebuilding America's Defenses from the Project for a New American Century, signed by usual suspects. They say exactly what they're going to do. So, I mean, the truth was out before these wars started. I'm talking about our recent wars in the last, century.
Yeah, someone came up with the term fog facts for this phenomenon. I mean, and the very document you just named is quoted at great length in the book. There's no question that the facts are out there. As I said, most of the real motivations for wars are not secret. They're just not endlessly repeated on the front page and on the television. And to go on television and shout about how Iraq has nukes or how Iraq could attack in 45 minutes are absolutely lies, no matter what else is happening in the world. But even just to go on television and talk about how Saddam Hussein is an evil guy, or Manuel Noriega wears red pajamas and does drugs and sleeps with prostitutes, and therefore we should have a war on his country. Those are lies if you're not also pointing out that he worked for the CIA and we played along with him up until this moment. You know, if something is on page 15 once, you know, if you know, the fact that we want a gas pipeline is there, or, you know, with Bush Sr., he started out talking all about oil with the Gulf War. The first Gulf War is all about oil until you had all these no blood for oil signs and protests, and then that went away. But it was still there on the back pages. In fact, the idea that wars are for profiteering, that wars are profitable, that wars are good for Wall Street, that's not a secret. That's something that the war planners push. They just push it once on page 15 and get the message across. I mean, they always have to make sure Wall Street thinks the war is going to be profitable. It's not a secret. It's that if you were to poll Americans as to what they thought the war was for, even the soldiers serving, as they call it, in Iraq, the vast majority thought they were there. May still think they're there, for all I know. I haven't seen a poll in 3 years. For revenge for Saddam Hussein blowing up the World Trade Center. You know, so, I mean, you can't say that these people are not engaged in a dishonest propaganda campaign simply because the facts can be found with some effort. Most people don't make any effort, don't have time, don't have interest, don't have understanding, whatever. They don't know.
Well, I applaud you, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book, and I'd really like to thank you for trying to get some true signal out there amidst all of this noise that the media puts out that is just drowning everyone in their lives. I mean, thank you, David.
Sure, thank you.
Well, I also want to say thank you. It's an admirable project, and I've been interested in the subject for several years myself, and it reminded me of one book that I read recently, actually 2 or 3 years ago. Mark Kurlansky's, it's called Nonviolence, 25 Lessons from the History of a Dangerous Idea. And it turns out one of the 25 lessons is that all wars, behind all wars, are a few founding lies. And so I was really struck by that, and I've thought about it the last few years. And I'm glad to see this book is out, and thank you also. And then I also wanted to ask a question on behalf of my beloved 5th grade son, Joshua. We were on our way here tonight, and he said he really did, well, actually this evening, he said he really didn't want to go. And then I told him what it was about, and we chatted a little bit about it. And I told him about the book, and he said, well, Mom, what about the Revolutionary War? Because he's learning about that in school. Mm-hmm. He said, I'm pretty sure we couldn't have gotten independent from England without the Revolutionary War. And I said, well, great, now we have another good reason to go. I said, you could ask. And so I promised him that I would ask you to talk about that particularly, because you are so thoughtful and thorough and clear in your thinking and research. And so I wanted you to respond to that. But then one more thing I want to say before you talk about that, and that is another question that we were talking about on the way over here. I said, Joshua, just pretend that I'm one of your teachers, which I am, because I'm your mom, and this is a field trip. And, you know, and we're going to learn more when we go. And I said, you know, and that raises another interesting question for me. Why do you think school children wouldn't go on a field trip like this? And I think that's a good question for me to keep in my mind as an ongoing basis as a teacher. Why don't young people go to events like this to talk about a book like this? Why aren't ideas like this talked about in public schools? And I think those are interesting questions for all of us to think about. And when we talk about lying and truths, it has a lot to do with, they have a lot to do with our thinking and how our thinking is affected by what we see and hear And you know, when we stop thinking and our ability to discriminate, and then have that affect more and more people, that intellectual discrimination, emotional discrimination, so we don't keep doing what we're doing. So anyway,
Yeah.
back to the Revolutionary War.
Okay, good comments and questions. You know, did the Revolutionary War get us independence from England? Yes. Was it the only way we could have gotten that? Absolutely not. Did we necessarily need to get that? Very much debatable. You know, is Canada worse off having not done the same thing? Very much debatable. When we invaded Canada in 1812, which was going to be a cakewalk, and they were going to bow down before us and welcome the American flag, you know, they didn't. They thought they were better off than we were. There were, of course, lies. Any war is a war based on lies. The Boston Massacre was not as it was depicted. It was lied about. It was lied about, including in engravings by Paul Revere. You know, it was turned into an unprovoked slaughter by the British of Americans. When you look at what happened with the Revolution, we went from being, the people who lived in the colonies, went from being ruled by, you know, a foreign aristocracy and an aristocracy loyal to a foreign throne, to being ruled by a slightly different American aristocracy. You know, George Washington was the wealthiest American. The people who wanted this were the wealthiest Americans, and they wanted a different aristocracy. And this was at a moment when there were endless rebellions and riots by working people, by slaves, and those continued after the Revolution, right? But not to quite the same extent. And the idea, which has been, you know, the downfall of so many people in this country for 2¼ centuries, the idea was to take all of that rage and direct it against a foreign king, direct it against the British. Let's not have a people's revolt against the wealthy. Let's have a different wealthy in charge. It's, you know, a choice between the Republicans and the Democrats. It's, you know, which elite are we going to be ruled by? And so when we think of the Revolution as liberating everybody, you know, it didn't liberate the slaves, it didn't liberate the farmers, it didn't liberate the people who continued to revolt after the Revolution. It changed, you know, it changed which elite was running the country. And could we have done that without a revolution? Of course we could. Other nations did. Might have taken a little longer, but we wouldn't have killed all those people in the process. You know, it's so hard to understand why you know, people who defend endless bureaucratic delay on every issue across the board in these governments like ours always think there's an urgent, pressing demand for a war this minute. Sure, we might resolve everything peacefully if we had a couple more weeks, but that doesn't matter because we have to have war now. You know, why does it always have to, you know, happen now? And, you know, it's not that people like Tom Paine didn't want a lot of good things for people, and it's not as if the government that was established in this country following the war wasn't a great step forward. But it's not at all clear that we had to have a war in order to get there. So you know, I don't know why I think young people in other countries are much more interested than young people in our country, and I don't know what all of the reasons are. I certainly there are a lot of things that are not on the tests in our public schools, but I just.
Well, I think it's why we teach what we teach. I think they're good questions for us to have on an ongoing basis. Like, why don't we teach certain ideas in our schools? Why don't we take kids to? And Joshua was saying, because it's religious. I said, no, it's not really religious. He said, because it's about political parties. I said, no, it's not really about political parties either. It's not, they're not allowed to teach politics or religion. I said, it's not about those things, so why not? But I don't have the answer, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Well, you have to teach politics, and you have to teach all of that stuff that's not in any of the history books that happens outside of and in between the wars. You know, it's when we think of our history as nothing but wars that we think we need more wars, because what else would we do? I think that's the problem with kids' history books. I think way in the back and then up here.
I had a statement and an announcement. I think that the wars that we're talking about, Afghanistan and Iraq, largely start here with local policy. And an example of that is that in America we use 5 times more oil per capita than the rest of the world. And the rest of the world isn't just going to give us that without a fight, and we feel entitled to it. And this gentleman here mentioned the Project for a New American Century, which Dick Cheney and Wolfowitz were involved in '89, and they said, clear up, you know, we need this oil. America needs a new Pearl Harbor to get involved in the Middle East. And the local decisions that we're making here are also affected by the same kind of lying that you're talking about. And I think we have a great opportunity locally to make decisions that will reduce greatly the impetus to steal resources from other places. And particularly here, the Meadow Creek Parkway and the proposed dam at the Ragged Mountain Reservoir are 2 projects that would basically be taking money from everybody to do projects that would increase sprawl greatly in this area for decades, and basically induce us to waste all that much more energy while taking resources from everybody, both financial and natural. There's going to be a city council meeting on December 20th, and anybody can come and speak to city council. You get 3 minutes. There's city council meetings at the first and third Monday of every month. And I would love to encourage everybody to inform themselves on those issues and either email or talk to City Council. It's very close. We've got Dave Norris and Holly Edwards who are on the side of protecting these places and living a more sustainable, in a more sustainable way. And so we just need one more counselor. So I hope people will check that out. Thanks.
Good, thank you. Dave Norris is also interested in what some other mayors around the country have done in posting the financial cost just in tax dollars of these wars to just our city publicly. But he hasn't done it. And I'm sure we could get the 2 city council members that you name to do almost any decent thing. It's finding a third that's the trick. And so if we can get enough public support organized to pressure them to do something and make them be able to do it in response to a big public campaign, then we might get that. You had a question?
Yeah, you mentioned in some part of the talk about an understanding of a genetic link to war in our species. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Is there any science around that?
Well, I spoke of rejecting that idea, not of discovering evidence for it. You know, America.
No, but is there a body of knowledge that says that we are genetically, you know, predetermined to war? I mean,
No, not
okay.
a remotely persuasive one, and it's something that I have a whole chapter on in the book. And there's a great deal of evidence in history and in prehistory of the majority of human societies and pre-societal humans having done just fine without war. Thank you. And you know, we are so obsessed with war that we impose it on others. Looking back, we look at the walls of Jericho, which were built for flooding, and we say, oh, those were walls built for wars, and we tell stories about it. We look at ancient bones of human ancestors, and we find war wounds when they are actually teeth marks of large cats. We were not warriors, we were prey. for most of our evolution. And so we read war into everything. When it isn't there, it needn't be there. There was no war in a large part of this continent before cultures came that imposed it. There was no war in Australia before the Europeans. War is not necessary. War develops in some complex, sedentary human societies and not in others. And we can do just fine without it. Maybe we should take like one more question and then do this okay, maybe two more questions and then do this less formally, and I want to sign books for anybody who wants one. But maybe on the right and then you on the left.
Comment first to war propaganda. I'm sure you're aware that in Mein Kampf, Hitler specifically cites the Americans as his source of inspiration for the Nazi war propaganda.
There's a lot on that in the book. We do have a lot. I mean, if we're going to claim absolute resistance to the greatest evil on earth, we have a lot to answer for. We were a large inspiration and an aid in many ways.
Right. Concentration camps being modeled after reservations. You go forward to Bin Laden, or they're saying both we support. There seems to be this pattern in history of us supporting our later enemies. So.
Yes, and most prominently and most destructively at the moment, the United States is far and away the leader in selling weapons to other countries. It's our big industry, and we sell weapons to countries that we later go to war with. And we sell weapons to countries to protect them from other countries we've sold weapons to. Which is the case in this soon-to-be largest weapons sale ever to Saudi Arabia, which we also learn, as if we didn't know it in the WikiLeaks cables, is the #1 funder of the terrorism against which we supposedly are fighting all of these wars. So, you know, make some sense of that one. Okay, here, and then you'll be the very last one. And then.
Do you think war is ever justified?
No. That's... do I think war can ever be justified? No. I mean, if the traditional right to defensive war is the idea if somebody attacks you, you can fight back. And legally, that is true, and you could make a moral argument in some cases that it would be true. If someone's attacking you, you have to defend yourself, you have to fight back. But I don't think it was smart to put that into law. When our ambassador, Kellogg, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for this, negotiated the Kellogg-Briand Pact with Mr. Briand, the foreign minister in France, and got 45 countries to sign on to this, 3 years after World War II. I'm sorry, this is after World War II. By 1928, we had 45 countries on the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which banned all war. All war is renounced. His position, Kellogg's position, was if you start defining aggressive war and what's a good war and what's a bad war, you're going to have loopholes that will be stretched until the ban on war is meaningless. And of course, we did. And of course, when the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty, they added exceptions, and one of the exceptions was defensive war. And of course, this treaty, which had on it the Soviet Union, Germany, Japan, England, France, the United States, dramatically failed to prevent World War II, but was used as a basis for prosecuting the crime of aggressive war immediately after World War II. When we got to the UN Charter, then right after World War II, you had two exceptions put in. Again, you had an exception for defensive wars, and you had an exception for wars that the United Nations says are police actions, which is an even more dangerous loophole. So, I mean, the first one, the defensive one, was traditional. It's not that it was invented in these treaties, but putting it in these treaties creates a loophole where you have countries like the United States say that they're fighting a defensive war preemptively by going halfway around the world and attacking one of the poorest nations on the planet. And the exception for UN Security Council authorized militarism has the United States claiming to be attacking Iraq with UN approval, despite the UN saying, no, you aren't. If these loopholes didn't exist, then when a nation was attacked, it would resist. It would resist, violently or not violently. There is no question. It's just formalizing it in the law it gives people the idea that some wars are okay and some wars aren't. And when you can hire people like Jay Bybee and John Yoo to write legal memos explaining why any war that the U.S. president likes is legal, you know, you've got loopholes that have been stretched to the point where the ban on war isn't there anymore. And I think it should be. I think that we don't tolerate the idea that some slavery is okay. We don't tolerate the idea that some rape is okay, right? Why in the hell do we talk as if to be fair and balanced, we must approve of some wars? It's sick to my understanding.
Which kind of leads me up to, this may be a difficult question to answer, or it may not be able to answer at all, but America being a mass-consuming society, and we probably further the objectives and the pocketbooks of these guys that, quote, you call on top. How much do they really care about somebody speaking out against war being right or wrong? Or how much do we really matter to them, whether we're going to stop their cause or their agenda or their plan for this. I don't know if they want a world takeover, or if they're just chopping at little countries at a time, but like, does my voice matter? Does 100 friends of mine matter? Does 1,000 people matter? Does 100,000 to 1,000,000 matter to them? Do they really care if we say anything about their war programs?
There's a wonderful piece of literature recently put out there by George W. Bush called, what is it called, Decision Points. And in this book, he says that in 2006, the minority leader of the Senate, the Republican, Mitch McConnell, who was screaming treason at anyone who opposed the war in Iraq in any way, went privately, secretly, to President George W. Bush and said, we've got to get those troops out of Iraq before the 2006 election. Right? That is how close the peace movement was in 2006 to influencing people who, to any available evidence, gave absolutely not a damn what any of us said or did, right? I mean, you can be very, very close, and it can look absolutely hopeless, right? In fact, it often looks absolutely hopeless right until you win. And of course, eliminating slavery and eliminating all sorts of horrors that are now considered done. Looked hopeless, looked absolutely hopeless, not long before winning. Winning takes often a longer attention span than we often have. It takes being willing to try and lose, and being willing to lose for your lifetime and have the next people win, right? The women who rightly get the most credit for getting women the right to vote in this country didn't get to vote. It was the women who came after them who got to vote. You have to look at history and understand that you might have to just work at this for your life and trust that somebody else is going to come along and win. You can't be motivated purely by winning. I know in organizing people to action, you have to feed them hope and victories, but...
Which leads me to say, don't they think that war is a means to bring about peace in the long run too?
I have no doubt that some people think that, and they are wrong. And history shows that they are wrong. And the past century in particular shows that nonviolent tools and nonviolent activism can accomplish things that war can't. And of course, war for the past century has been something very, very different from anything prior to it that was called war, which should be categorized more with wrestling than with war. When you look at the horrors of modern technological warfare, and we cannot survive it. Whether you think wars with lesser weapons in a different planet, with a different ecosystem, with a different economy, could be justified, we can't survive war in this world. So I'll leave you with that, and maybe we can talk less formally, and I can sign some books. And thank you for coming out.